All right, well, hello everybody. So the book that I did my thesis on was Stephen Baxter's Evolution, and it's a pretty cool science fiction book. I'll talk more about it in a second. So just brief background on the author. Stephen Baxter is one of the biggest names in British sci-fi for a lot of his work. He's written over 50 short stories and full-length novels and has several different series out. And behind it all, he has a master's in mathematics and a doctorate for engineering from Cambridge, which is where he sort of gets. So he actually knows what he's talking about, which is really nice. Oh, he also writes predominantly hard sci-fi, which is contrasted from soft science fiction in the fact that it's at least somewhat scientifically accurate and doesn't just sort of throw the laws of physics and everything else out the window in favor of storytelling, which is fairly refreshing compared to a lot of most other science fiction literature. So yeah, he writes about 3 different sort of topics. One of being is future history, which is talking about how essentially it's chronicling human events that that'll happen in our future, which is sort of self-explanatory, but it lets them sort of paint lets them play with a lot of different concepts, which is really cool. Then alternate history, which is just taking an event in the past, saying what if it happened differently, what would that do to everything. And this last one is speculative biology, which is the one that I focused on most with evolution, because that's looking at how, based on certain factors that are coming, most likely what will mankind sort of do to adapt, how do we think we're going to adapt to these new situations biologically as opposed to just mentally or sociologically or what have you. Interesting stuff. A lot of scary stuff can come out of this topic. Just scary visually. But yeah, so evolution, this book is pretty ambitious because it covers 565 million years worth of time. It starts 65 million years in the past and focuses, beginning with mankind's earliest ancestor. This is the first ancestor between primates and all the rest of the other animals. This little squirrel-looking thing called Purgatorus. And it's from this starting point that he just progresses all the way through pretty much every single major primate-based ancestor of mankind, all the way up through to man, and then into a future where mankind goes extinct, and how what of our genetic lineage, how that remains and what happens to them. Yeah, he goes all the way so far into document 500 million years in the future, when the sun's expanded and turned red, so it's quite interesting. But yeah. So Huff is one of the few things that he does, unlike a lot of others, is once again covering a stupid amount of time in very, very great detail. And he's really good at making a lot of the reader and stuff react to characters that don't have the mental capacity to respond emotionally to the things that are happening to them. Because if it were a human dealing with any of the situations that he puts a lot of these characters go through, that are basically animals, it would be horrifying to our psyche to deal with it, because the amount of I guess that's just the way nature is, but for them it's the amount of murder, rape, and all those horrible things that happen to them, which to us we would perceive that way as just life is normal for them. But it's interesting how he makes you react emotionally to the characters that can't react that way themselves, which is kind of interesting. And yeah, once again he takes relatively little artistic license with the science. I mean, he does throw in a few speculative dinosaurs just because of the amount of time it's been. He theorizes there's probably some other interesting stuff we haven't found yet, which I agree with, but that's really about it. Another thing unique about him is he's decidedly pessimistic compared to a lot of other science fiction writers who I think, when they are pessimistic, it's a little bit less of just, it seems more to me like cautious optimism, saying mostly oh, this thing could happen, but I think, as long as we, don't do that or do something else, we'll change, we'll be fine. Whereas Baxter is sort of more just kind of it doesn't really matter. This is sort of the quote that I used to explain it, because he says, As the natural systems of the planet broke down, humans would discover conclusively that they were still, after all, just animals in an ecosystem, and as it died back, so did they. Which is sort of what he's suggesting, and I'll talk about that a little bit. And one of the things that Baxter's work draws a lot of inspiration from is this book by Olaf Stapledon called Last and First Men. I actually really like that book, and I'm reading it right now, but it was written in the 30s, and so unlike Baxter's work, it has that sort of like 30s like progressive sort of optimism a little bit to it. It has this sort of unrealistic version of the future where it's like, oh, mankind will always be great, we'll always just get better and everything will be good because science. And so it's kind of funny seeing how he characterizes most of what happens in his novel, but yeah. This book was even more ambitious because, as it says here, it covers 2 billion years of future, not even the past, just taking from 1930s and going 2 billion years into the future. But that was also when they thought the universe was older than we realized that it actually is. So that colors some of his numbers. But yeah, he also was one of the first people to create like a science fiction sort of epic as a genre within that, because you see that a lot more in fantasy, but he's one of the first people to actually truly create like a work that spans, you know, centuries or tells some sort of a novel that that we could classify as an epic, I guess. But yeah, his work is interesting because the way he writes this is he takes, the reason why it's called Last and First Men is he starts with like our mankind, you know, labeled the first man, and then essentially chronicles the creation and like eventual downfall of 17 like descendant species that come out of that after all the things that have happened, and how they deal with various events, like how they spread out across the stars and various other things. It's a really cool book, worth reading. It's just that point. Another one of the things that both of these books focus on is posthumanism, which is this idea, which is this sort of philosophical concept of testing our definitions of humanity and like consciousness and sentience against other technological changes or just other things, sort of like picking apart how we define humanity and saying like if, you know, what factors, if we remove certain factors from it, if we can still count the creature, like count the thing as human. And it's a pretty interesting way of looking at it, and Stapledon is again one of the first people to look at this, since his work dates from the 30s, back when people were, I mean, I guess they were sort of trying to work on this, but not much. Science fiction was a semi-new topic by then-ish. But yeah, Baxter touches on this a little bit. Some of his other works are focused a little bit more on this topic, but evolution does touch on it, which is part of why I mentioned it here. But yeah, Stapledon's work is one of the ones that colors it a lot, like some of the most. He wrote this book with each of the 17 descendant species sort of as like a case study to say like, are we still human if blank, or are we still human if we don't have blank? Like, one of the examples he comes up with is the fourth men, who were created eventually, were created by the third men to essentially be biological computers. So they were literally just a massive brain in a concrete box. And the way they interact with the rest of the world is through essentially artificial like sensory organs. Essentially, they're basically just a biological AI. And he seems to assert that even in that case they are still human, which is an interesting take. And then the 18th men are interesting because they can subsume their entire conscious self to potentially unite into what is essentially a hive mind. And so it's that creation of like, are we still human if we lose all of our sense of individuality? Are we still human if we don't have a body? Are we still human if we lose all vestige of like appearing human? Because one of the other races that comes out of this, because I believe they adapt to like Neptune or something, and this is back in that world when they thought, oh hey, all the planets clearly have a surface and like we can totally live up there. Like they thought Venus was covered in swamps instead of the volcanic hellhole that we now know it is. But in that case, like they develop into these like pterodactyl looking things. It's just sort of this idea of, once again, it's like, yeah, are we still human if blank? And another interesting fact that I had about the 18th men is they also, for some reason, have 94 subgenders between male and female, which means a traditional family unit contains all 96 of them for them. which is a bit ridiculous, but I found it interesting. But yeah, and Stapleton, once again, is a lot more optimistic about his future. I mentioned parallels to another book on this topic in my paper. I didn't quite have time to discuss it in this because there's still a couple other topics to talk about. So yeah, Baxter's, his friend, this is sort of where I mention it with him, because in evolution, since the book is told from like snapshots of a bunch of little evolutionary creatures, he also sets up a frame story for modern man so that we understand it. And I believe he sets his in the year 2045, where after dramatic climate change, resource depletion, and various other cases, humanity is very much nearing the edge of the collapse of all known society. And so the frame story he's talking about is essentially a last meeting between all the scientific minds to sort of try to, get the world on track, in the last few minutes that they have left. And it's not really his posthumanism here isn't necessarily as major of a focus within his book, but he does say some pretty interesting things within it. And I mean, though we don't really get to discuss it as much as I would like, because the case study involved, as well as the entirety of mankind, is wiped out by the eruption of the Raval supervolcano, which is set to happen at some point, and we're way overdue for it. We're way overdue for a silly amount of things that could kill us all, but that's another topic. But yeah, in this future world that they mentioned, one of the things he talks about is like the wealthy and the elite have been able to use like the advances in genetic engineering to create basically the perfect child genetically viable for them. But the tampering that they do play with the human genome, they do it so much to the point that the children of the elite are now genetically incompatible with the rest of mankind. They're essentially now a different species, biologically speaking, as they can no longer produce viable offspring with the rest of humanity. And not just non-fertile, just non-viable completely. They're that different. And so essentially he's saying it's like, at that point, which side do we define as man? In the little time he takes to discuss this, that's sort of the question he's trying to ask. It's like, are they still men? Are they still human because even though they're no longer really Homo sapiens at that point? And it's an interesting philosophy. Yeah, one of the things that they mentioned is this sort of idea. It's kind of and I think it's partly because of the elite having to do this. It sort of creates, once again, almost a class system again, but that's now genetically stratified instead of materially or whatever. But yeah, this idea. It's like, which side do we regard as human, and which side do we treat as below that? Because eventually a hierarchy is going to form if we have any kind of individualized society at all. So yeah, just an interesting, weird thought to think. It's like, if we actually encountered people who were genetically incompatible with their different species, how would certain things even be considered or thought of? So it's just interesting. But yeah, this is the main thing that, so one of the main things that evolution talks about for most of the book is the study of man's sort of cognitive history. It's like the evolution of how what we now call the human mind, how that even came to be, and where we see a lot more of these, a lot of these traits that we assumed were just human, we're noticing a lot farther back in our evolutionary history than we had previously thought. But he covers a lot more of the milestones. One of the biggest ones, which is the reason why we have the brains we do, is actually social interaction. It's because of the fact that once mankind's ancestors became diurnal, as opposed to the little nocturnal night creatures that could hide from dinosaurs and various other things, once we made that switch after all the dinosaurs were wiped out and it was safe to walk around in daylight without getting stepped on by a T-Rex, this sort of groups, social interaction began to happen because it was safer for them to, because the easiest way for them to deal with predators is they were still small. And it just eventually became the most effective way of doing it. But this development, these kind of groups, that's really the genesis of conscious thought, because the initial cases where we see consciousness as we think of are purely for social interaction. And these groups kind of created a sort of snowballing effect, because for more people meant more food, which meant, which also created more people once again, which created more complicated social interactions, which mean a bigger brain to deal with it, which meant more food again. So it created this endless cycle, which continues today to some extent, and shapes how we evolved. But the other big milestone, which we're now realizing we can see a lot in like the rest of the great ape species, is this concept of mind, which is the ability for, it also once again heightens social interactions, but it allows them to do a lot of, some very human things with how they interact with each other. But the concept of mind, briefly, essentially states it's the ability to not only have a sense of self, but also to recognize that other entities can have their own motivations or like drives to be wanting to do things. And once that can be understood, you can sort of create, actually beyond that, once you get to that point, you can start to do some pretty interesting things. One of the biggest things you can now do by knowing this is you can lie. Like, for the first time you can actually conceive the concept of deceiving someone, because you can rationally understand what they want and what they're trying to do. You can subvert that or help them either way. And in a world like this, it's sort of like, you notice a lot of times it seems like on the same way that mankind, like animals can't seem to deceive each other the same way man does. It doesn't seem like they necessarily outright lie in quite the same way that we do. I mean, also that's also because we can't really understand how they communicate, their actual language. But that's beside the point. But this is one of the biggest steps, and this sort of sticks with. We kind of stick about here for like the majority of our evolution. It isn't until around, I believe, the actual creation of like the hominids, like when you actually get to genus Homo, like Homo erectus, Homo habilis, all those, that you finally start to see another trend upward, and that's the beginning of correlation. Correlation is the next biggest step because that's the ability to realize, oh hey, if I take this rock and smack it against a harder rock, I can make a pointy rock. And that's when we're figuring out things like, oh hey, if I rub these two things together, this hot substance that cooks food is produced. It's the ability for them to start to put two and two together. And I have to make a distinction between correlation and causation because on a cognitive standpoint, we consider those to be two different levels. And as far as we know now, the most intelligent creatures besides us are like roughly at the middle of this point. They're beginning vaguely to understand correlation, like, for instance, some species of ravens have figured out that if they need to like open a nut or like something like that, they'll wait by the side of a road and like they'll drop the nut on the road and wait for cars to run it over so that it'll crush the nut and then they can go get it themselves. Or like how ravens can also memorize short like 4-digit combinations to safes and actually use then remember it and then open the safe to get food. Various other things like that. It's the ability to draw realization that, oh, if I do this, this happens. But causation is the biggest one because that's the ability to understand why, to actually create a understanding of, this happens because this, not just this then this. It's sort of like, the way I define the two, it's sort of like, correlation is sort of like saying you have the like concepts 2 + 2 is 4, but you don't know what order they go in. It's like you have all those pieces and you understand in some way that 4 and 2 are related, but you don't know how yet. And causation is the ability to figure that out. And that's really where sentience, as we consider it, comes into being. Because from causation, most every single thing that we think of that defines mankind exists now. Like all the concepts of religion and, because one of the biggest ones that comes out of causation is religion. Because for most humans, especially before the beginning of modern science, every causal chain ended in a deity, ended in some sort of first moving force. And so from causation you can start to create, the concepts of art as well. You can create actual better tools that you actually think about instead of just, where beforehand, even like with monkeys when they use sticks, that's not like an example of them cognitively, remembering that. It's not like a conscious action to them. That's instinctual. Their brain compartmentalizes that. And they've actually shown like the different brain activity that lights up when they do that compared to when they're interacting with each other, which lights up in ways that humans could more recognize as human brain activity. But yeah, those are the main parts. And then last thing I mentioned up here was, this is just kind of another visual aid for that. It's the pyramid of cognition, where on an evolutionary scale, this is roughly how things sort of develop. We're not really completely certain where self-knowledge should go on this pyramid, which is why it's sort of stuck down here. But we know that occupational knowledge and just basic ability to gather data, like, oh, hey, if I eat this, I'll throw up, or I can eat this and not throw up. That sort of thing is down here, and pretty much one of the most fundamental ways of thinking about everything. And the next step being, of course, the generic information processing skills are really just the ability to actually make decisions based on that. If given choices where pure instinct doesn't have a direct answer, the ability to then to choose between the two when there are multiple options, which, and as we've seen, most of the rest of the animals are sort of here. We have a few that we think, like apes, like most of the great apes, like chimpanzees, orangutans, gorillas, and those, they think that they're starting to cross this threshold into beginnings to create like metacognition for other things beyond just social interaction. So like starting to actually achieve the barest, like, inklings of sentience, which is in some ways kind of terrifying, because that would mean eventually we may actually see one of the great apes like achieve full sentience potentially within the evolutionary lifetime of mankind anyway. Not in our lives certainly, because biology takes forever, but yeah. But yeah, this is, metacognition is, from what we understand, has pretty much always been like the sole domain of mankind. This is sort of where we were able to say man is smarter than everybody else because we can think about things, we can just think of all things consciously instead of just the way most other animals do, the logic of like, oh, as most of the animals being dominated by the biological terms, the 3 Fs of like fighting, feeding, and mating. But yeah. Yeah. But that's sort of like, metacognition is the ability to transcend that and actually think through logically what they're doing.
Self-sense.
Oh, I got it.
Yeah, that was my final little thing. And with that, my rambling now, with that I bring my rambling to a close. Thank you for bearing with me. Woo.